In this video, we'll take a look at CodePen. CodePen is a free online app that you can use to play around with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can see up here, there's 3 panels. There's an HTML panel, there's a CSS panel, and there's a JavaScript panel. You can collapse these panels if you want to. And then there's a live preview area. So in a lot of ways, this is going to dovetail into what we're going to be doing with Dreamweaver. Dreamweaver has a similar interface. What you do in CodePen is you create pens. They're called pens. And you can experiment with HTML, CSS. And you can see live previews, and you can do all kinds of good things with this, just to get a sense and a feel of how things operate. And then we can move beyond CodePen and get into Dreamweaver more. What I want to talk about in this lesson is something called the box model. In every web browser, we have something called the DOM, which is the document object model. And that document object model contains elements, HTML elements. And each HTML element has its own properties, or a series of properties that can be affected. HTML, this part, is just the structure of the document, or the structure of the pages that you're working on. CSS would be the style of the elements that you're working on. In this particular case, I have a div tag. That's the structural element. A div tag means division or divider. It's a tag that you can put any element inside of. And what I'm doing here is I'm giving it a class with a name of block, and that block is getting these styles. So it's telling the block to be 350 pixels wide and 250 pixels high, and it's giving it a background color of this color, and it has a margin of 0 auto, which means it's going to center. So if I were to take the browser window and I were to change the size of the browser window, you see that that stays in the center. The margin 0 part is that it's 0 margins on the top and the bottom, and auto means it's auto left and right, which means it's going to be centered in the web browser. Now you notice here on the top, even though I set this margin to 0, there's still a space here. And the reason why there's a space here, there's a default space because of browser preferences. Browsers have their own preferences, and generally they have their own margins and padding. So what I can do about that is if I go into CSS here, I'm going to add a selector. This is called the selector. I'm going to add the star selector. Star selector means anything in the document, or any element in the document. And I'm going to flatten out the margins and the padding, and I'm going to zero them out, and you can see what happened there. So what's nice about CodePen is you get interactive, you get live feedback for any changes that you make. So any change that is made here or here is going to be reflected here. So you can see that that collapsed that area. I no longer have any padding in that section and any margins. So getting to that, we have a box here, and the box has its width and its height, but it also has 3 properties that we want to take a look at. So any element that is a block element, and this happens to be a block element, the div element is a block element, is going to have these 3 properties. It's going to be border, it's going to be padding, and it's going to be margins. So we can get a sense of what's going on with the margins already. The margins are centering this on the page. We talked about that earlier. And then for border, I'm going to add a CSS property here called border. And I'm using the shortcut here just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to say the border is 2 pixels. It's going to be a solid border, and I'm just going to give it a black color. I'm using a hex value here to show that color, and I'll just make this border thicker. I'll make it 5 pixels, and you can see that the border goes along the edge of the box. So it's on the edge of the box here. Now, the padding of the box right now, there's a default padding, but if I wanted to increase that padding, I can increase it. So if I say that the padding is, and I'm using padding as a shortcut for all of the padding, if I say 10 pixels, that's going to have 10 pixels inside that block. Now you're not going to see the effect of the padding. So let me take that out just for a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a comment tag here to comment out the padding. So then the padding will be removed temporarily. And what I'm going to do in the block itself, inside of the div block, I'm going to add another element. So let's say I add an h2 element here, and I'm just going to put some text in it. I'm just going to put in the word block, and I'm going to close that tag, and you'll see that the word block is here. Now when I put the word block here, you'll see that it's right up against the left edge and the top edge. So right now there's no padding on this block. Remember earlier that I put this star selector and I put the margin at 0 and the padding at 0. So that's why it's all the way up at the edge here. Now if I were to remove the comment from the HTML code here, now the padding takes over, so that I have 10 pixels of padding on the top, on the left, on the right, and on the bottom. So that's how that operates. If I put a background color on that H2, maybe this will be a little bit clearer. So if I say H2 and I say background dash color, and I'm going to give it a background color. You can see what's happening here. So it spreads all the way across the block, but then it runs into the 10 pixels of the padding on the left and on the right, and it would be on the bottom as well if this were taking up the entire space. So this, the other thing to see here would be the margin. So right now this H2 doesn't have any margin. If I were to give it a margin, let's see what happens if I give it a margin of 20 pixels. So that pushes it inside by 20 pixels. It's hard to see, but there's extra space now. So the margin is on the outside of the element. The margin is always on the outside. So it's on the outside of this element here. That's why this one is centered. And that's on the outside of this element. And that's why it got made smaller. It's smaller because we've added 20 pixels on the left, the right, the top, and the bottom to this element. If I were to add padding to this element, so if I say padding, let's say 8 pixels, the padding gets added to the inside of the block. So padding is always on the inside of the block. Margin is always on the outside of the block. And then if I were to add a border, and I'm just going to give it a gray color. So the border goes on the edge, but it's inside. It's on the edge of the block. It's not inside of the padding, and it's not outside of the margin. The margin's out here in this invisible space, and the border is on the edge of the block. Let me just add a little bit more to that so you can see it better. In CodePen, you can save your pens and you can give it a name, and we'll continue working with CodePen so we can see some other elements, and we'll continue working with HTML, CSS, and eventually we'll get to JavaScript as we work with CodePen.